and welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My guest today is Beth Lambert. How are you, Beth?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Excited to have you on the show today. So, Beth, you are a children's health advocate and the founder and executive director of Epidemic Answers. This is a nonprofit organization reestablishing vibrant health in children through education, empowerment, and prevention. You're also the author of A Compromised Generation, the Epidemic of Chronic Illness in America's Children, and co-author of Brain Under Attack. You're a former healthcare consultant and teacher. So welcome to the show today.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure. So I wanted to start off, we're at a time where the pandemic is well underway, and we are seeing, definitely improvement with the vaccines coming out, in certain areas of the world. So I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts, and have you done any work with how children specifically have been affected during this pandemic? And, this could be in the way of not only just health, but maybe socially as well, because too often we see that, children bear the brunt of these things much more than adults might. If an adult stays at home, they can sort of keep themselves busy. They've got things to do around the house. But children, they need to be watched. They need to be mentored when they're missing out on school, when they're missing out on education, on friends, on a social setting, especially, kids who were supposed to go into the first year of school and meet friends. It's very, very different from an adult who's almost sort of got the grooves already going for them, right? So I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, I think there's so much more we're going to learn out of this moment that we've lived through over the last 18 months or so, that we're just beginning to collect data on, and we're just beginning to analyze and better understand. So in many ways, we don't even know the impact on our children's physical and mental health over the last, based on what they've experienced over the last year and a half. We just know, and there's people that are beginning to really look into this and understand that this is not good. That what's happened to our kids is definitely going to have an impact, and perhaps long-term impact, especially children who are younger. What I can say, though, is that, my nonprofit organization has been doing research for a number of years on what are the things that make children healthy or sick. We look at chronic illness and why it develops. So we have some original research that we've done that looks at the many environmental factors that contribute to the development of chronic health conditions like ADHD, autoimmune diseases, asthma, allergies. And what we have found is that there is this generalized phenomenon that we call total load, which is that the more stressors a child has on them, the worse their health outcomes tend to be. So, we don't tend to think about, maybe a little tiny amount of toxins in their environment as making that big of an impact, or a little emotional stress making that much of an impact, or, the social isolation that we've seen over the last 18 months. Like, is it really making a difference, all those little tiny stressors? And what we found in our research is that, yes, little tiny stressors, even though they on their own don't seem like a lot, they add up, they're cumulative, they're synergistic. Wow. So, if you think about what the children go through in normal life, pre-pandemic, right? They have, hundreds of daily toxic exposures, whether that's endocrine disruptors, whether that's heavy metals, whether it's preservatives and additives in foods that are toxic to the body. They have tons of kind of unseen stressors, things that people don't necessarily equate with stress on the body, such as stressors from computers and devices and electromagnetic radiation and those sorts of things. They have, developmental stressors by being, as infants being put in baby walkers or seats. So they're not actually developing the way that they're supposed to, the way the human body is supposed to. So these are just a couple of the pre-pandemic stressors that children in the modern world are exposed to. And then you layer on top of that all of these unique stressors, and the outcome is not going to be good. So, the fact that children today have, unprecedented health challenges just by living in the modern world, and you compound that with the moment that we're in right now, where there's additional stressors, that is really going to create some long-term consequences, I think. And not, again, we're going to not really know and understand the degree to which there's stressors that, the impact of this last year and a half have had on them. But we know based on our research that it's going to have a negative impact on physical and mental health. So we already have 1 in 2 American children with at least one diagnosed chronic health condition. So if we were to do another epidemiological study in the next year or so, I'm certain that we would see a much worse kind of outcome.
Wow, that's amazing, because I traditionally tend to think of, maybe shouting, physical abuse, nutrition deficiency as, being sort of maybe the primary stresses for children. But you've just listed a whole A to Z of many other things, and, things that are, we're not conscious of, and, latent things that can be affecting children. And this ultimately affects the vibrancy of the child, right? And growth.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just it about the stressors of modern living, is they're so small. Right. So if you have, for instance, let's take fluoride, for instance, which is controversial because it's used in, most dental practices, and it's considered, important for preventing dental caries or, cavities. And that's also shown in the medical literature to be neurotoxic, especially when it's compounded with aluminum or other toxins. So, so you go through your life and you use fluoride toothpaste and you don't think it's a big deal because it's a teeny tiny little bit, and how much harm could this really have? But the fact of the matter is that a child growing up in the United States, or really the modern industrial world, has exposure to literally thousands of things that weren't there over the course of human history and human evolution. So we don't think about these many variables as impactful. But again, our research is showing that when you add them all up, they're causing all kinds of problems. And then here's an example of something that is making this kind of total load impact even worse. There are, I'm sure you're familiar with antibiotics, and they've saved lives, and they're a miracle kind of drug. Mm-hmm. But they have consequences. And so we overprescribe antibiotics, and, for every viral infection, even though, antibiotics don't actually do anything for viral infections. So the problem with using too many antibiotics is they disrupt our microbiome, and our microbiome is really important for regulating our immune function, for manufacturing neurotransmitters, for helping us detoxify. So if you actually think about all the different toxins that we're exposed to in modern life, and if you have a microbiome that is robust, and again, that's all the microbes in and around your body, but mostly in your gastrointestinal tract. If you have a rich, diverse microbiome that's evolved over millennia and has created this wonderfully strong immune system, but you go in and you take a couple rounds of antibiotics and you destroy that microbiome, you're not going to be able to effectively detoxify from all those toxic exposures the way you would normally. So that's what I mean about things being compounded and synergistic. It's like the toxins alone are bad enough, but when you handicap yourself by wiping out your defense system, which is all the microbes in your gut that usually detoxify and help you excrete toxins from your body, then you've got a much more complex and difficult situation to deal with. And that's what's happening with our kids, is that, they just have, as part of living in this world, the things that we have normalized, like antibiotics and pharmaceuticals and, plastics that are in every corner of our lives. Those are all normalized things. So we don't think about them, but they're actually really causing a lot of damage cumulatively and over time. And our kids, of course, they're the most vulnerable. So we as adults have a greater capacity to deal with them, partly because we went through our developmental milestones with less toxic burden. But now our kids have a greater toxic burden at critical times of growth and development. So that's why we're seeing this moment where we have a massive epidemic of, mental and physical health conditions with our kids.
Well, no, that's very true. And I'm reminded of when we think of, our parents or our grandparents or even our great grandparents, the vitality and the energy that they had, at their age, that's proof of the pudding, right? It shows it right there, and how you're saying it's diluted as the generations go on.
Right. And there's something to be said too. There's research on how each successive generation, when it doesn't have the health supports that it needs to give, robust growth and development, it gets worse and worse and worse each subsequent generation. So if you look at nutrition as an example, there are studies that show that multiple generations of nutrient deprivation result in less robust human beings. So that feels like something we don't pay enough attention to as well. It isn't just, I've been talking a lot about toxins and the cumulative and synergistic impact of stressors. There's another piece, which is that we're not supporting our health in the way that our bodies need us to. So the things that were, part and parcel of our grandparents' lives, good nutrition, real food, nutrient dense food coming from rich soils, that isn't there for the modern human being. The other kinds of really wonderful supportive things that we used to do that we don't do anymore is like sleep. We, we have endless entertainment on our screens, and we're sitting around watching these things late into the evening, depriving ourselves of the sleep that we need to allow our bodies to restore and refresh. And think about how for millennia human beings have been outside in the sunlight. And that sunlight exposure on your skin is so important for the development of vitamin D, which is good for immune health. It also helps regulate your sleep patterns. It helps your cells in your mitochondria make energy. But when we now have moved our lives indoors, we don't have that sunlight that we need for good health. So again, this is about too many stressors, but also not enough health supports like exercise, good sunlight, good nutrition, sleep, all those kinds of things. Basics that our grandparents didn't even have to think about, right?
Yeah.
But now it's like we have to actually remind ourselves to sleep. We have to remind ourselves to exercise. We have to remind ourselves. It's like it takes effort, because in the modern world that's not normative. That's not what we do. We do too much that is indoors and away from kind of our natural roots and how we as human beings have evolved over, thousands and thousands of years.
Sure. And, by that regard, while our lifespan might be increasing, our health span seems to be compounding net negative, right?
Well, also, what is a lifespan mean if you're on, chronically on medications,
Right.
and you're depressed and you have anxiety and you can't walk because your arthritis is so bad, right? So lifespan is not the only measure of health. Quality of that life is something that we need to pay more attention to, because are we really living up to our potential? Do we have optimized health? And the answer is, in the modern world, no. There's a lot of suffering that's needless, but it's really a function of how we're living.
Sure. Okay. And if we look at sort of, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, so the endemic is something that's limited to the immediate community or organization, and then we've got the epidemic, which comes after that. It might affect, I guess, the country, and then you've got the pandemic, right, which is basically the epidemic with a passport. It goes around the world. Is that sort of like the hierarchy of things?
Yeah, and if you're looking at children's health in particular, separate from this moment of pandemic and an infectious disease that's circulating, if you're looking at the totality of children's health, the places that are the worst in terms of having the most children suffering from chronic health and developmental conditions, they're the most modernized, the most industrial. So a lot of nations that are, developing, that don't have, access to the industrial food, industrial pharmaceuticals, industrial agriculture, those kids are actually much healthier. And those kids are living closer to kind of what we would want to do to optimize health. They're living closer to the rhythms of nature, and maybe don't have access to all the plasticized stuff and things. They don't have access to the fancy pharmaceuticals that are depleting the microbiome. They don't have access necessarily to all the electronics and the crazy kind of intense go lifestyle that many kids in the modern industrial world do. So it isn't like necessarily an American thing or a North American thing. It's a problem that is most pronounced in the Western world, but really most pronounced in the industrial world. So really places that are industrialized are seeing the worst health problems with our kids.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because I, off the top of my head, would definitely think that, in those developing countries, it might be worse off because their natural infrastructure and regulations aren't in place like ours, basic things like maybe sewage, or environmental, the factors over there. But, from what you're saying, what we have in terms of, genetically modified agriculture and, technology, that, human-made sort of stressors, those are faring much worse than, nature's stressors maybe, right? Or
Well, we've swapped out, right? We've gone from this age of infectious diseases as being sort of the primary thing that we focus on for health to this age where, in the modern industrial world, we've done a lot to manage infectious diseases. And there's a lot more we could actually do to manage infectious diseases right now, for instance, that, with the pandemic, what's not being promoted is the fact that vitamin D levels, hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of blood sugar over time, all of those are things that could actually help us manage disease better, infectious diseases. But my point is that, we've gotten better at managing infectious diseases. And what's emerging is it's a chronic health problem. It's the autoimmune diseases, it's the neurodevelopmental and behavioral diseases that are emerging. So it's like we've swapped one for the other. Like we can manage cholera outbreaks by having clean water and sewers. And we can manage a lot of the infectious diseases because we have the tools to, but the chronic diseases are not a direct consequence of those management tools, but they're related, right? So we've kind of swapped one problem for the other. And we have the information and the knowledge and the tools to be able to manage both effectively, but it is a matter of education. It's a matter of access. It's a matter of really changing our paradigm about what we think health is. We are, for the last really 30, 40 years, we've been consumed by this idea that health is a function of genes and germs. In other words, like whether you develop an autoimmune disease is a function of your genes. What did you inherit? Did you inherit a propensity to get cancer? Did you inherit a propensity to develop an autoimmune disease? And then the other part of it is germs. Did you get exposed to germs? But health is way more than just genes and germs. It's actually about the totality of your environment. What's your mental health status? What kind of emotional stressors are you dealing with? What is your nutritional status? What's your exercise and movement patterns like? What are your sleep patterns like? We know so much more about what makes an individual healthy in terms of what science understands, in terms of what evidence has been collected. But yet that hasn't trickled down to public health policy. It hasn't trickled down to people's daily lives. We are still stuck in the genes and germs paradigm. And that's, part of why we have so many sick people today is we just need to get over it. It's not just genes and germs. Genes and germs are important. I'm not saying they don't factor into your health, but they're one small piece of a whole person health picture. And we're completely ignoring like 75% of what is actually important to whether a person is sick or whether they're healthy. It's also relevant to this pandemic, whether a person gets severe COVID or whether they get long COVID or whether they don't get COVID at all, has a lot to do with environmental factors that no one's paying attention to. Your nutritional status, your vitamin D level, your blood sugar level, your metabolic health. But we could do a lot better if we just started looking at the whole person and all of the factors that contributed to health instead of these limited windows like genes and germs.
Sure, no. And, definitely someone like Bruce Lipton, in his book, Biology of Belief, he's shown that it's not just only genetics, it's genetics in combination with the environment. The environment is something that can trigger the genetics. So while you've got genes and germs, those might be the triggering factors. Like you're saying, it's the holistic environment that might even have the deciding factor for something like this.
Exactly. And as Bruce Lipton talks about, mindset and consciousness are critical parts of that, right? That you can, it isn't just about nutritional status and it isn't just about, your exercise. You can actually manipulate and modify your own body's resilience, your own body's health based on mindset and consciousness. And I think there's lots of literature coming out about that. That's actually a really exciting area of science. It's so new. But I think it's great because it's empowering, right? If you can improve your health through mindset and consciousness, I mean, that's an incredibly powerful tool that everybody has access to. That's the most exciting part to me, that it's not a fancy drug that costs $700 a month. It's something that all humans are born with. How cool is that?
Yeah, and all humans can do.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, so I mean, if we look at, epidemics for children, there's a whole laundry list of them, everything from, ADHD to asthma to, blood clots, cancer, chicken pox, just, their mental health, ear infections, rubella, shigella, obesity, mumps, etc., measles, even lice, right? I mean, so I wanted to know, children, when they go to school, especially in the early years, kindergarten, grades 1 to 3, etc., they come home with a lot of things. But adults, when they go to the workplace, they might come home with the flu or a sore throat or something like that, a cold or a cough. Why is it that children are more susceptible to all of these things? Is it because they're still in those early years and the immune is growing, and that's why they're getting those things, rather than why the adult typically might not, if that's the correct way of putting it?
Well, if you think about something like measles or chickenpox, that are very common childhood conditions, or RSV, or even just like, common colds that maybe some of the adult population isn't as susceptible to. There is a phenomenon in human communities and populations where the children get these infectious diseases partly due to the naivete of their immune system and not having had exposure yet. But what happens, interestingly, before vaccines and pharmaceuticals and other kinds of things that change the dynamic a little bit, what happens in human populations, if you look back in history, is that when these children get these infectious diseases, typically if they're well nourished and slept and cared for and in an environment that's nurturing, they make through these infectious diseases just fine. They don't have to be deadly. They don't have to be scary. And for thousands and thousands of years, children have been extremely resilient with these childhood infectious diseases. They get the infectious disease, they bring it home to the parents. And what happens is it serves as a kind of inoculation for the family, that the adult's immune system is robustly triggered again. The adults have antibodies and they respond to it, and it builds up their immunity. It's why shingles, for instance, with chickenpox was not as much of a major issue until more recent years, where children stopped getting chickenpox because of their vaccine. So there's this give and take with it, right? So on one hand, you have children who are, part of their experience in childhood is getting exposed to infectious diseases. And it isn't just chickenpox and measles. There's literally thousands of viruses out there, and thousands of types of bacteria that can make somebody develop, an immune response that looks like sickness. That it's not just these few things that are something we've recognized or learned about, but they get these infections, they bring them home, they sort of re-inoculate the adult population. The adult population is like, oh, thank you so much for exposing this to me again, because it's kind of like a booster, right? And then the adults don't get sick, they have the antibodies, and it gives them that exposure again, so that their body continues to recognize it and continues to mount an antibody response. That's a natural phenomenon that's gone on for time immemorial that is being challenged and tested now in the modern world. So, there's a lot of literature on this. There's a lot of research on this, looking at the evolutionary dynamics of infectious diseases, in particular in children, and how that has a benefit for the whole population. But it's not something that's necessarily talked about in the mainstream media. It's not necessarily well understood by most primary care practitioners who see this. They're just trying to help their patients. They're just trying to figure out how to address the symptoms immediately. But it is an interesting phenomenon that I think there's, again, really good science, really good research behind. A lot of evolutionary biologists have interesting things to say on the matter. And I think we should understand that nature is complex and human communities are complex. And, we should remain humble in terms of our understanding of what our interactions with microbes are about, and not to assume that microbes are bad and that we should keep them away, because they actually might be serving us in a positive way that we may or may not fully understand. So I think it's really important for us to remain humble and not to think that we as humans need to control every single microbe. And especially with all of the research that has been done over the last 20 to 30 years on the microbiome and how so many of the microbes that interact with us are actually doing us a favor. And that even includes viruses. You know, we know that there's good probiotic bacteria, for instance, in our gut that do all those things I mentioned before, but there's viruses out there that are actually providing a benefit for us. There are even some parasites that have a beneficial role for, you know, regulating our immune system. So I just think as humans, we need to be humble, and we need to, you know, think about health from a place of humility, and respect for nature and nature's rhythms. And I think, you know, childhood health is an opportunity for us to do that. But it does take a lot of effort, I think, for especially those who are really, you know, inclined to want to control the situation. It does take a lot of patience and mindfulness about what we're doing.
No, for sure. And, you know, it's almost as if you have to go to the opposite to achieve the opposite, right? I mean, you have to get sick to get well in some instance, because, you know, going through these stressors, you know, these infectious diseases in a mild way, you're building up your immunity by diversifying your microbiome with these viruses, right?
Yeah, I mean, training your body, teaching your body, you know, to interact with the world. I mean, like human beings are not meant to be plasticized indoors, you know, and separate from the microbial world. We are not meant to do that. So we can't pretend that we can run and escape from microbial exposure. Sanitizing things, that's actually caused more health problems. I mean, sanitizing in terms of like your home environment, like that has caused more health problems because of the toxic exposures and the lack of exposure to the microbes that we need to train and educate our immune systems. That's not something we're managing very well. And I think we need to be, again, more thoughtful about, you know, if we decide we want to cut out microbes from our existence, we want to separate ourselves from them. Well, what's the consequence of that? What's the downside of that? How is that going to handicap my body and my immune system by not having the exposures, by not giving my body the ability to practice developing a robust immune response? So I think we just need to, you know, before we get, you know, locked in fear about microbes, that's really like a 19th century thing. It's like an old, you know, like as soon as we got germ theory and in the end of the 19th century, all of a sudden everyone's afraid of the microbes. But it isn't that simple. It's more of a balance and a give and take and a symbiotic type relationship that we need to honor and we need to respect.
Got it. No, that definitely makes sense. And what would you recommend to parents? Say, for example, you know, their child gets sick with something. It could be something very small or, you know, something on a larger scale during the recovery period, because, you know, from the child's point of view, they're a different child. They don't have that vibrancy, you know, the energy is low. You know, they might be thinking something's wrong with them. And sometimes I would imagine, you know, depending on what type of sickness you have, that can carry over, right, into your mindset and your confidence and things like that. You might be missing out on the school play or on an outing or something, or, you know, a birthday party or, so for parents, they should really be treating the child differently, right? Because now the child's going to have more needs, which might be stressing, you know, a working parent more who's already trying to, you know, balance things. And any things you might recommend to them on the recovery stage or convalescence stage?
I think what I would say to that, my response to your question is that we need to remember what symptoms are. So if you have a fever or aches and pains or a headache or whatever your symptom is, that is your body's communication to you to tell you that something is out of balance. So the minute we try to suppress a symptom, make it go away, ignore it, fight through it, it's just going to bury that deeper and come out again. So, or come out with a worse or exacerbated set of symptoms. So what I believe is that we need to honor those symptoms. So if you have a symptom that emerges in a child, again, fever, and they're staying home and they've got congestion, you have to honor that. And and to have gratitude for it and say, that is the body's way of telling you, I haven't eaten well enough. I haven't slept well enough. My resources are down. My vitamin D and my sun exposure is too low. Whatever it is, it's a message to you to better support yourself, to better build up your resilience and your robustness as an individual. So every time I see somebody with symptoms, I'm thinking to myself, all right, are you taking that as a message, or are you kind of cursing the symptoms? Because if you take it as a message, a communication from your body, and you honor that and you respect it, it's a way for you to learn from it and, build more robust health downstream. And that's kind of the way I see how it should be managed. So, to get more practical about that, it might mean, like, as a parent, your children need, some vitamin support, whether that's through whole organic natural foods or vitamin supplementation. Maybe your child needs more sleep. Maybe they aren't getting the emotional support that they need. And maybe that's something we dismiss all the time too. Like emotional stress can totally knock your immune system out. So, those are, again, thoughts that we as parents need to be having if we see symptoms in our kids is what is out of balance? What can I do to restore balance for my child?
Oh, that's amazing, because too often we associate the person with the symptoms. They become the symptom almost. It's their character. But really, what you're saying is it's the message of what's going on. And linguistics also, NLP, they share a similar sort of concept where the person is not the behavior, even though people would associate the person with the behavior and call the person the behavior. Really, it's quite contrarian, but the behavior is separate from the actual person.
Exactly. So there's no doubt that that's true. And I think we discount how much is going on. Again, going back to mindset, like, if you see yourself as a sick person, you're going to be a sick person. Yeah. That's just, it is what it is. And whether it's NLP or linguistics or however, whatever framework you use to describe what's happening, mindset from Bruce Lipton, are you telling your genes to turn on? Are you telling your genes to upregulate, downregulate? Whatever concept, conceptual model you want to use to describe what's happening, there is no doubt. And we're at this point, it's 2021. We have plenty of evidence showing how much our mindset, our attitudes, and our beliefs actually concretely, biochemically, physiologically actually result in changes in our body. So we need to be thinking about that too. Like, am I if I have an autoimmune disease, does that make me who I am? If my child has an autism diagnosis, will they always have an autism diagnosis? Is that who they are? And there's a lot of controversy about that right now, because, sometimes people think that autism, sometimes there's a predominantly gene component. But in many, many cases, there's a lot of environmental components to it, right? And so it's important that we understand the full picture, the complexity, that there's environmental components, there's mindset, there's beliefs, and then there's other things that are more concrete or material.
Oh, definitely makes sense. And I do wonder sometimes if my allergies in the late summer do come on because I put it in my calendar, right? So the mindset is everything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's not the only thing, but, like, can it contribute? You bet. It definitely could.
And we've seen it with, patients who've gotten, the diagnosis of terminal diseases, and they've, lived through it. They've come out from that because when they were told that, they never believed it to be true.
Right. Well, and then there's evidences of people who have, I wish I could recall the paper. There was a peer-reviewed publication about somebody who got the wrong cancer diagnosis and got a terminal cancer diagnosis, and then died several weeks later, because they thought that they had this terminal cancer diagnosis, and then found out, the family found out later that was an incorrect diagnosis. And there's all this speculation that it was that person's mindset that actually, they believed that they were dying of cancer, so therefore they died of cancer. It's, that kind of research, I think, needs much more emphasis, because we need to understand that phenomenon. We need to understand that the placebo effect, for instance, is real. It's an actual thing that impacts your body. So again, more research there would be so empowering for us as humans if we could really just acknowledge that our minds are powerful.
No, I like that. I like that because, I guess the best medicine you can give your children is the power of a positive mindset, and that'll really see them clearly through life.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt that that's hugely important, especially for kids.
Well, that's amazing. Thanks again, Beth, so much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. And if people do want to get a hold of your work or contact you, where's the best place for them to reach you?
So we have two websites. Our nonprofit organization is called epidemicanswers.org. And we have a special research project called Documenting Hope. And that research project can be found at documentinghope.com. And we actually have a study going on right now where we're testing the hypothesis that if you remove a child's total load and increase their health supports, that they will drop their diagnosis, improve their health. And we're actually enrolling participants in that study right now. So people can learn more at epidemicanswers.org or documentinghope.com.
Okay, awesome. And I'll be sure to put those in the show notes as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks again, and I wish you well.
You too.